Silent Tribe. The equilibrium of the ice had endured for eons uncounted. Only the timeless song of the wind had disturbed the silence during all those ages, its wistful lament lulling the frozen wastes in their eternal sleep. The infrasonic sub-bass whump of the experimental sonar equipment was imperceptible to the scientists who developed it and installed the emitter array out there on the ice. Its incessant rhythmic pulse was inaudible to the crew of the Devon Island Sonic Research Facility, but somewhere out on the featureless ice wastes, it had disturbed something forgotten that had long remained hidden from the eyes and from the memory of humanity.
God damn it, not again!
Dr. Janet Edwards tore off her bulky headphones and tossed them down onto the cluttered desk. Outside, beyond the insulated walls of the research complex, the lonely wind sang, rising and falling, never quite dying away to silence. A ceaseless funereal lullaby choired to the limitless vastness of the slumbering ice.
"What's the matter?"
inquired Briggs, shuffling into the lab carefully, carrying a tin tray with hot cups of tea and biscuits. She turned as he entered, her grey eyes levelled on him. She looked ruffled and ill-disposed.
"Number 3's out again,"
she shrugged. "Again?" he repeated, nonplussed. She stood abruptly, her chair grating across the floor.
"Get your gear on, Bob. We're going out there to take a look. I want to see if I can get it back online."
"Is that wise?"
he said doubtfully.
"Have you seen the weather report? There's a blizzard coming in."
Briggs glanced at his watch, clawing at the cuff of his pullover to reveal its face. He glanced up at her in concern as she pulled on a heavy parka.
"Not to mention that sunset is in 6 hours,"
Briggs continued.
"Once it drops below the horizon, the sun won't rise again for 10 weeks.
"Exactly,"
she smiled.
"If we don't get this thing fixed now, we can scrub the entire winter season. All the data will be skewed if we're not running a full array. You know what we're up against here, Bob? If we come back empty-handed this time, the university's gonna pull our funding for good."
She glared at him, daring him to object. He hesitated.
"We should wait until Dennis gets back. It's his call. He's the boss,"
Bob asserted as firmly as he dared. Janet sighed, exasperated.
"It's not that far. An hour out, an hour back, and an hour or so to fix it. Hopefully,"
she shrugged.
"If we wait for Dennis to get back, it'll be too late. We'll all be on the unemployment line if I don't get this damn thing back up and running, Bob. And it has to be now."
Bob stammered.
But, you know the regulations. We shouldn't leave the station unattended."
She had donned an oversized orange bobble hat that came down to the nape of her neck, covering her ears. Now she pulled on a huge pair of dark snow goggles, their elastic strap pinning the woolly hat tight to her head. She looked like a cartoon insect. Even through the dark goggles, he could feel her eyes on him.
"Fuck the regulations, Bob."
She held out a gloved hand.
"If you're not coming with me, just give me the keys."
Bob held her gaze for a moment. He thought about objecting to that, but instead, he dropped his eyes to the deck, his right hand rummaging in his trouser pocket for the keys to the Bobcat. He dropped the set sheepishly into the doctor's outstretched palm without meeting her gaze. She left the lab without another word, her heavy boots clumping across the deck, and Bob watched her go. At her back, the sun was a frozen gunshot that bled in a thin runnel of red across the southern horizon. The station was far behind her, lost in the sun's dwindling glare. It couldn't be far now. She knew she hadn't missed it, knew her bearing was true by map and compass, her position confirmed by the cumbersome GPS unit the university had provided earlier that summer. The Bobcat's motor droned on, as it had for the last hour. Emitter 3 was farther than she'd thought, or rather, the going was slower than expected. The recent fall of snow had been heavier out here than it had been at camp. Outside the heated cab, the wind maintained its mournful aria to the bitter cold. Ahead, beneath the shifting gossamer shimmer of the northern lights, the horizon was lost in the gloom. The featureless grey snowscape blending seamlessly into the overwhelming blackness of space that loomed overhead, vast and endless, and pinpricked by a scattering of early stars. She felt a subtle pang of loneliness intimate itself at the sight of it. That great vista of desolation to the north. She felt, instinctually, Perhaps for the first time, the sheer remoteness of the place. A picture formed unbidden in her imagination. The picture of her tiny, insignificant self, lost and alone in the inconceivable vastness and biting cold of space. Adrift in a limitless ocean of time, a tiny, flickering flame of consciousness set against the immensity of an inanimate universe of stone-dead matter. The notion irritated her, and she thrust it aside. She wasn't prone to such wayward imaginings, and its appearance, here and now, rising from her subconscious mind, disturbed her more than she cared to admit. "Pull yourself together, woman," she told herself. "You're a scientist, for God's sake, not a damn fiction writer." A few minutes later, the abbreviated metallic structure of Emitter 3 became apparent up ahead, its twisted form emerging out of the deepening twilight under the glare of the Bobcat's headlights. It was damaged, that much was clear. Dr. Janet Edwards drew the Bobcat to a halt beside it, examining the damaged equipment thoughtfully through the side window as she pulled on her gloves. She popped the hatch with a clunk and stepped out into the drifting snow, her footsteps crunching as she advanced on the ruined equipment. She had suspected it would be beyond repair the moment she'd seen it from the Bobcat. Now, up close, her suspicions were confirmed. The thing had been smashed, physically torn apart. She couldn't imagine how it might have happened. Couldn't think what could have done this. She gazed, dumbfounded at the wreckage, as the wind picked up around her, gathering itself for another solemn chorus. This would mean the end of her research. Perhaps the end of her career as a field research scientist. She explored, with a swelling sense of despondency, the implications of what that meant. The monotonous routine of a university lecturer stretched out before her with its interminable looping schedule, each year running into the next, a life on repeat. The same tired theories trotted out to a new crop of faces year after year, time and time again, until retirement. She wasn't sure she could face that. She blinked and looked up, startled at a hint of movement caught at the edge of her vision. A sharp spike of adrenaline flared hot in her chest as she became aware of them. There, beyond the remains of the broken emitter, half hidden in the gloom, and partially obscured by the fall of drifting snowflakes, stood several towering figures. Motionless, they watched her in silence. "Bob, what do you mean she's gone out?" growled Dennis McLean, stamping the caked snow from his boots.
Emitter 3 is packed up again. She went out to fix it. I tried to tell her, Bob shrugged. But you know what she's like. She won't take no for an answer.
Bob looked at him, his eyes pleading clemency. Dennis sighed reluctantly. "Yeah, well, you got that part right, Bob, but you should have gone with her." "Why didn't you go with her, Bob?" he demanded. Bob shrugged, his palms upturned.
"And leave this place unattended? Dennis, you know as well as I do that's against regulations."
Dennis eyed him sidelong, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Going out alone is against regulations too, Bob," he chided. "How long's she been gone?" Bob glanced at the clock.
3 or 4 hours. She should be back any time now.
He smiled weakly. Dennis took a step toward him.
"Have you looked outside, Bob? There's a blizzard coming in, and the sun goes down in less than an hour."
He stared coldly at his colleague. "Have you at least tried to raise her on the radio?" Bob frowned.
"Of course, but she's not answering."
The third man, Borge Rasmussen, gripped McLean's shoulder with a hard hand. Pale blue eyes glared from one to the other out of a thick beard. He jerked his head toward the door. "Now is not the time for talk. If we want to find our friend, we must go now." The wind sang solemnly against the steel hull of the second Bobcat. Behind the wheel, Dennis McLean squinted into the gloom. Snow was falling heavily, reducing visibility down to just a few yards. The Bobcat's powerful headlights doing little more than illuminating the nearest of the falling flakes. They followed the deep tracks left by Dr. Edwards' Bobcat hours before, but with every mile those tracks became less and less distinct as they were steadily erased by the falling snow. "Try her again," snarled McLean with concern. He was agitated. She'd been out too long. When they set out, they had hoped to run into her on her return journey. But so far, nothing. Something had happened. He could feel it. Rasmussen keyed the mic and raised it to cracked lips. "Dr. Edwards, do you read me? Over?" He paused as they both listened intently to the empty static coming back at them over the airwaves.
Dr. Edwards, it's Borges. If you can hear me, sit tight. We are coming.
Time and their arduous trek wore on. Both men were on edge, both silent, save for Rasmussen's intermittent and seemingly futile radio transmissions. Both were lost in their own imaginings, looping through possible scenarios and hoping, or praying, that they'd find their compatriots somewhere out here in the frozen darkness. Up ahead, smudgy crimson taillights appeared in the gloom, followed by the dark bulk of Janet's bobcat looming out of the snowflake darkness. Its headlights were still burning, illuminating sonar emitter 3. It was smashed beyond repair, that much was readily apparent in the headlight glow, and it was clear from the banked drifts against the machine's caterpillar tracks that the vehicle had sat idle here for some time. The obvious answer to her continued absence, the answer Dennis had formulated and clung to throughout the journey, had been that her transport had suffered an electrical fault. That theory was quashed the moment they arrived to find the cat's headlights still lit up. Dennis McLean drew the bobcat to a halt and both men exited with flashlights in hand, leaving the bobcat's engine running at idle.
Go check out the emitter.
Dennis hollowed above the wind.
I'll check out the cat.
Rasmussen signalled his agreement with a half salute and moved off, his bulky form silhouetted against the bright glare of the headlights. Dennis slowed his pace as he approached the parked vehicle. A swelling sense of stunned curiosity overtook him as his flashlight beam played across the cat's torn hull. The thing had been ripped open. Engine pads and body panels, he now saw, lay scattered in the snow about the vehicle, and as he looked closer, he noted the oddly dragged trails of heavy footprints in the snow about the ruined vehicle. He didn't know what to make of it. Hurrying forward, Dennis shone the flashlight into the darkened cab. It was empty. Janet wasn't there. He had hoped that they'd find her here, waiting for them in the cab, half frozen and pissed off but otherwise in good health. Now he was at a loss. What the hell had happened to the cat? And where the hell was she?
Hey!
He heard Rasmussen shouting distantly over the rising wind.
Hey! Over here!
There was an edge of panic in that voice. Dennis broke into a run in answer to his friend's call.
What is it?
Dennis demanded, stumbling to a halt beside the brawny Norwegian.
Look,
Borges said doubtfully, his eyes blazing in the lamplight glow. He directed his flashlight downward, illuminating the shredded and bloody remains of a coat at his feet. A broad patch of gleaming crimson spattered across the snow beside it, along with the tattered remnants of an orange bobble hat. The comforting thrum of the bobcat's idling engine fell abruptly silent.
What the fuck is going on?
Snarled McLean. There was a sudden blur of movement behind Rasmussen. A great, shadowy figure came toward them, looming out of the snowflake dark. A huge, contorted hand suddenly gripped the Norwegian's head, its long, pencil-like fingers driving into the flesh of his face with crushing force. Dennis stared in paralysed horror. He felt a warm jet of piss down his leg as the blood began to flow. Thick runnels of glistening ichor gushed down the Norwegian's face under the pressure of that vice-like grip. Then, the skull collapsed with a sickening crack that brought Dennis back from the brink. He turned and ran, but he didn't get far. Matteo Savard loathed the Arctic winter. When he'd first received his transfer papers, Matteo had been excited. It had sounded perfect, the name Coral Harbour, conjuring to mind the image of a balmy tropical beach, lined with palm trees, a warm sea lapping at the shore, sun-blessed holidaymakers sipping cocktails in the shade. The place had been inaptly named, either by accident, or through some sardonic whim of its founder. In truth, Coral Harbour was a freezing, ice-bound settlement in the Canadian high Arctic. To Matteo, it was hell. He'd been stationed at the little Canadian naval outpost as a radio operator for almost 3 years, and he didn't think he could hack another winter in the place. The thought of those seemingly endless weeks of utter darkness stretching out ahead of him set his teeth on edge. He should have acted sooner, should have submitted the papers for the transfer he'd been contemplating for months. But he hadn't. Instead, he'd procrastinated, whiling away the summer months fishing and drinking with his few local friends. The place wasn't so bad in summer. In summer, he enjoyed the bright emptiness here at the top of the world. During the long summer months, the dark days of winter seemed far off and remote, their crushing monotony and oppressiveness sublimated by the sunshine. Now it was too late. His transfer would have to wait until spring, and he would have to endure yet another winter in the dark. Matteo needed a drink. He knew he wasn't meant to leave his post in the radio shack, knew it was a serious breach of duty that could result in severe punishment, but the last supply vessel had departed south on the previous evening, and they hadn't had a contact report for 22 hours. Nothing was moving out there among the icebergs in the frozen darkness. Everyone with an ounce of sense had already left and gone south for the season. He locked up the shack and crossed the rutted, snow-crusted street to the bar. Just one beer, he told himself as he elbowed the door open. A warm glow flooded out into the night at the opening of that door, accompanied by the mellow drawl of country music. Matteo kicked the snow off his boots and sidled through the crowd to the bar. Just one beer, then back to the radio shack. A drink would calm his nerves, he reasoned. His thoughts looped back to dwell on bitter self-recriminations regarding his belated transfer as he took his first pull from the bottle. Perhaps he'd resign his commission and leave the Navy altogether. Head south. He didn't know where he'd go or what he'd do if he quit the Navy. All he knew was, nothing could be worse than another black winter at Coral Harbour. Bob Briggs was alone. The others had been gone for hours, and the station was empty and silent, save for the low drone of the diesel generator housed in the adjacent block, and the relentless song of the wind, a wind which seemed oddly oppressive now he was left here by himself. Normally, it wouldn't even register. He was so used to its omnipresent tone. He'd tuned it out months ago, had become blind to it, like the smell of your own home, so familiar you don't know it's even there. Now it irritated him. Its long, lingering minor chords troubled him like never before, somehow deepening the sense of vulnerability and solitude that had gradually descended over him since the others had vanished into the night. The distant cry didn't register at first, drowned out as it was by the wind. His subconscious dismissed it as a trick played by an overwrought imagination. It was, he mused, merely an unusual tone, produced by the wind whistling through the sundry structures of the station. But slowly, as that unsettling cry continued and drew closer, he could disregard it no longer. Uneasy and inexplicably afraid, Bob inched over to the window, peering anxiously out into the darkness outside. Cupping his hands against the glass, he could make out nothing in the gloom. Quickly, but quietly, he shifted position to the main door, again peering out into the dark through its little eye-level door light. Again there was nothing discernible out in the shifting darkness. That eerie, plaintive cry sounded again, somewhere out in the night. Surely it was McLean and the others, he thought. Nearby, perhaps lost in the blizzard, or injured and in need of help. He should go to them. He knew that. Yet he remained immobile. There was something about the timbre of that cry that disturbed him, something that held him in check. Slowly it dawned on him. They weren't desperate cries for help. They were screams. Screams of terror and pain. The petrifying sounds worked on his mind as he listened, torn by the desire to help his friends and by the heightening fear that with every passing moment pressed upon his mind. With an abrupt clunk, the lights went out. Bob gasped, groping blindly for support in the sudden blackness and finding the edge of the desk. The generator must have failed. Outside, the screaming continued, freezing his blood as he shivered there, alone in the dark. Then the lab was flooded with a lurid red light. The emergency batteries had kicked in. Bob sighed, grateful for this small mercy. Moving swiftly across to the radio set, he quickly set the dial to 156.65 MHz, and with a shaking hand, he keyed the mic.
Does anyone copy? This is Devon Island Sonic Research Station. Can anybody read me? Over?
The thin masculine voice was distant and degraded with static. But that didn't matter. No one was there to hear it. The radio shack was empty and quiet, save for the low moan of the wind outside. The dials of the transceiver glowed with a dull yellow warmth in the darkened office. A single lamp illuminating the coiled cable of the radio mic, discarded on the desk where it lay atop a scattering of papers, telex printouts mostly, weather reports, and the minutes of shipping communications. A crimson neon glow blared in through the blinds from the bar across the street, accompanied ever and again by a half-heard hint of country music and muffled laughter. The radio set crackled to life once again.
This is the Devon Island Sonic Research Station,
said the distant voice through the static.
I don't know if anyone can hear me. If you can, I really need your help.
The voice trailed off and was lost in a hail of static that in turn faded to silence. The wind wailed on outside the shack, flecks of snow streaming past the window stained with neon red. Overhead, the beige formica clock on the wall ticked away in the half-light, its second hand inching around the face, marking the steady passage of time in precisely delineated increments. Then again the stillness of the cramped office was broken.
I'm the last one left. Everyone else is missing. Edwards went out to fix the sonar equipment, and she never came back. Rasmussen and McLean suited up and went out after her into the blizzard. That was 6 hours ago.
The voice trailed off with a click, the silence stretching out into a long pause scattered with static. Then the voice returned, whispering close to the microphone. This time the voice was hesitant and edged with fear.
I can hear screaming coming from outside. Listen.
There was a distant cry audible among the static, half concealed by the howling of the wind as it rose and fell. Swelling behind it, and blending with it, was an agonized human scream. A scream of pain and terror.
I'm going outside to take a look. It must be the others. Perhaps they found Edwards. They probably need my help.
Mundane sounds came distantly over the airwaves. The shuffling of a drawer, and a hand digging, then a slam, and the strident tearing of sticky tape. Then the whispering voice was back.
I'm gonna tape the mic open. If anyone's listening, you'll still be able to hear.
The scrape of a chair amid the static, the swish and zip of a coat going on, the clump of Arctic boots on that distant deck, and the blustering wind as the door was thrown open. Then the sharp snap and crackling hiss of an igniting flare. The Radio Shack door clicked open, and Mathieu Savard tumbled into the office in a flurry of snow. Slamming the door behind him, he shed his coat onto the floor and slumped into his chair, setting a half bottle of beer, his 8th, onto the desk beside him as he scratched his thready beard. He was drunk, but not too drunk to notice in surprise the wind and static coming faintly over the radio. He fumbled for the headphones, cranking up the volume. "Hello?" he said into the mic with an almost imperceptible slur. "This is Coral Harbour. Come back." Over the radio, the howling wind continued and abated, intercut with static, and finally punctuated by a thin, hysterical scream that was soon joined by a second screaming voice in a grim chorus of agony and existential terror. Matteo dropped the mic, staring at it, half lost in shock at what he'd heard and in his own vague fears. What had happened at the distant camp so many hundreds of miles to the north? And what the hell was he doing here at Coral Harbour? Why the fuck didn't he put in his papers for that transfer? The last cargo barge had left that previous night, and now he was stuck here till spring. Mathieu Savard loathed the Arctic winter, and now that loathing was tinged with the first inklings of fear. At 11:23 p.m. on February the 6th, 1984, the Canadian Naval Communications Station at Coral Harbour received a cryptical final message from the Sonic Research Facility located on Devon Island in the Canadian Northern Territory. Upon subsequent investigation, all hands were found to be missing, and it was presumed that they had fallen victim to a rogue polar bear attack. This speculative conclusion is to date unconfirmed. As a result of the tragedy, all research at that location was terminated.